Sarah Martinez had always been different from other dog owners in her neighborhood. While everyone else chose golden retrievers or Labradors, she fell in love with a gentle giant named Bruno at the local animal shelter. Bruno was a 3-year-old Pitbull with soft brown eyes and a coat that shimmered like copper in the sunlight. The shelter volunteers warned her about his breed's reputation, but Sarah saw something special in the way Bruno gently took treats from her, and in how his tail wagged hopefully whenever someone approached his kennel. The first few months with Bruno were like a beautiful dance of trust building. Sarah lived in a cozy house on the edge of town, where suburban streets met wild woodland. Her backyard bordered a thick forest that stretched for miles, filled with oak trees, berry bushes, and a small creek that babbled through the undergrowth. Bruno loved this space immediately. Every morning he would patrol the fence line with the dedication of a security guard, but his approach was always curious rather than aggressive. He would sniff every corner, investigate every sound, and greet the occasional deer or rabbit with a tilted head and gentle whine. Sarah worked as a veterinary technician at the local animal clinic, which meant she understood animal behavior better than most people. She noticed how Bruno had an unusual gentleness for such a powerful dog. When neighborhood cats wandered into their yard, instead of chasing them away, Bruno would lie down and watch them from a distance, as if he understood they needed space. Birds would land near his food bowl and he would simply move aside, allowing them to share his kibble. This behavior amazed Sarah, who had rescued many animals over the years but had never seen such natural empathy in a dog. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening in early spring. Sarah was preparing dinner when she heard Bruno making an unusual sound from the backyard. It wasn't his normal bark or whine, but something softer, almost like a concerned whimper. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped outside into the drizzling rain. The motion sensor light illuminated the yard, and she could see Bruno standing near the large oak tree at the back of the property. His body language was different than usual. Instead of his typical confident stance, he was crouched low, his head tilted toward something near the base of the tree. As Sarah approached, her flashlight beam caught movement in the wet grass. There, huddled together and soaking wet, were 3 tiny raccoon babies. They couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. Their eyes barely open and they were shivering uncontrollably. Sarah's heart immediately went out to these helpless creatures. She looked around for any sign of their mother, scanning the trees and bushes, but the adult raccoon was nowhere to be found. The babies were making soft chittering sounds, clearly distressed and hungry. Bruno seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He had positioned himself between the babies and the rest of the yard, creating a protective barrier. His massive head lowered toward the tiny creatures and he sniffed them gently, his tail wagging slowly in what Sarah recognized as his calming behavior. The raccoon babies, instead of being frightened by this enormous dog, actually seemed to crawl closer to his warmth. It was as if they instinctively knew that Bruno meant them no harm. Sarah's professional training kicked in immediately. She knew that baby raccoons separated from their mother had very little chance of survival in the wild, especially during a cold spring rain. She also knew that many people would simply call animal control and let nature take its course. But looking at Bruno's gentle interaction with these helpless babies, and seeing how he had already appointed himself as their guardian, Sarah made a decision that would change all their lives. She carefully scooped up the 3 babies, noting their weak condition and obvious need for immediate care. Bruno followed her every step as she carried them toward the house, his eyes never leaving the small bundles in her arms. Inside, Sarah prepared a warm, soft box lined with old towels and positioned it near the heater. The babies were so young they still needed bottle feeding, and Sarah knew she had formula at the clinic that would work for wildlife babies. That first night, Sarah took turns with Bruno watching over their unexpected guests. Every few hours she would warm formula and carefully feed each baby with a small syringe. Bruno remained stationed next to the box, occasionally sniffing the babies or gently nosing the towels to make sure they stayed warm. It was remarkable to watch this powerful dog transform into such a careful, nurturing presence. The raccoon babies responded to both their human and canine caregivers with surprising trust. They would snuggle against Bruno's warm fur when Sarah placed them near him for warmth, and they eagerly accepted their bottle feedings. Sarah named them Bandit, Shadow, and Pepper based on their unique markings. Bandit had the classic raccoon mask, but with extra dark fur around his eyes. Shadow was the darkest of the 3, almost black except for his tiny white paws. Pepper was the smallest, with gray and brown speckled fur that reminded Sarah of ground pepper. As the days passed, it became clear that this was not going to be a short-term arrangement. The mother raccoon never returned, and the babies were far too young to survive on their own. Sarah consulted with wildlife rehabilitation experts and learned that hand-raising baby raccoons was a complex process that could take months. The babies would need constant care, proper nutrition, and eventually, preparation for release back into the wild. What amazed everyone who visited during those early days was Bruno's unwavering commitment to his new role. He seemed to understand that these babies were vulnerable and needed protection. He would position himself near their box during feeding times, creating a calm, secure environment. When Sarah had to leave for work, Bruno would lie next to the baby's enclosure, standing guard until she returned. His gentle nature, which had first attracted Sarah to him at the shelter, was now blossoming into something truly extraordinary. 3 weeks into their new living arrangement, the raccoon babies had grown noticeably stronger and more active. Their eyes were now fully open, revealing bright, intelligent gazes that seemed to take in everything around them. Sarah had moved their enclosure to a larger space in her spare room, complete with branches for climbing and shallow dishes for water. The transformation was remarkable, but what caught everyone's attention was the unique relationship developing between Bruno and his adopted babies. Every morning, Bruno would wait patiently outside the spare room door until Sarah opened it for their daily visit. The raccoons had learned to recognize his gentle footsteps and would immediately start chittering excitedly when they heard him approaching. Bruno would enter slowly, his massive frame moving with surprising grace as he settled down next to their enclosure. The babies would climb to the side closest to him, reaching their tiny paws through the mesh to touch his fur. Sarah began documenting this unusual friendship, taking photos and videos that amazed her colleagues at the veterinary clinic. Dr. Peterson, her supervisor, initially expressed concern about a Pitbull being around wild animals. But after seeing Bruno's behavior firsthand, he admitted he had never witnessed such natural parenting instincts in any dog. Bruno seemed to understand exactly how much pressure to apply when gently nosing the babies, and he had developed a special soft whine that he used only when communicating with them. The feeding routine had evolved into a carefully choreographed dance between all 4 animals. Sarah would prepare bottles while Bruno positioned himself next to the enclosure. As she fed each baby, Bruno would watch intently, occasionally making soft, encouraging sounds. If one of the raccoons was reluctant to eat, Bruno would gently paw at the enclosure and make his special whining sound, which somehow convinced the baby to take the bottle. It was as if he understood that proper nutrition was essential for their growth. As the raccoons grew more mobile, their personalities began to emerge distinctly. Bandit proved to be the most adventurous, constantly exploring every corner of his enclosure and often attempting to escape to investigate the larger room. Shadow was more cautious but incredibly observant, watching everything Sarah and Bruno did with intense concentration. Pepper remained the smallest but showed remarkable intelligence, quickly learning to manipulate latches and solve simple puzzles that Sarah introduced to keep them mentally stimulated. Bruno adapted his behavior to each raccoon's personality. With Bandit, he was more playful, occasionally engaging in gentle games where the baby would try to climb on his nose while Bruno remained perfectly still. With Shadow, he was calm and reassuring, providing a steady presence that helped the more nervous raccoon feel secure. With Pepper, he was especially gentle, seeming to understand that the smallest baby needed extra protection and care. The neighborhood had begun to take notice of this unusual family. Sarah's next-door neighbor, Mrs. Chen, initially worried about wild animals being raised so close to her property. However, after meeting Bruno and seeing how he interacted with the raccoons, she became one of their biggest supporters. She started bringing over special treats and would spend hours watching the daily feeding sessions through Sarah's kitchen window. Word spread to the local elementary school, and Sarah found herself giving educational presentations about wildlife rehabilitation and the importance of treating all animals with kindness. Bruno became something of a celebrity, demonstrating how gentle and patient dogs could be when properly trained and socialized. The children were fascinated by the story of how he had found the babies and chosen to protect them rather than see them as prey or threats. The raccoon's enclosure had to be expanded twice as they grew larger and more active. Sarah converted nearly half of her spare room into an elaborate habitat, complete with multiple levels, climbing structures, and hiding places. Bruno supervised every modification, walking through the space to inspect each addition before the babies were allowed to explore. His protective instincts had only grown stronger as the raccoons became more mobile and curious about the world beyond their enclosure. During this period, Sarah consulted extensively with wildlife rehabilitation experts about the proper timeline for releasing the raccoons back into the wild. The consensus was that they would need at least 6 months of care before they could survive independently, and even then, the transition would need to be gradual. Sarah worried about how Bruno would handle eventually saying goodbye to the babies he had helped raise. But for now, she focused on ensuring all 4 animals remained healthy and happy. The veterinary clinic became a regular destination for health checkups, with Bruno accompanying Sarah and the raccoons for every visit. The staff marveled at how Bruno would position himself near the examination table during each raccoon's checkup, providing moral support and remaining calm even when the babies became stressed. His presence seemed to have a calming effect not just on the raccoons, but on other animals in the clinic as well. Local news stations began reaching out after hearing about the unusual interspecies family. Sarah was hesitant about publicity, but she realized that Bruno and the raccoon's story could help change negative perceptions about pit bulls while also educating people about wildlife conservation. She agreed to one carefully controlled interview, which aired during the evening news and touched the hearts of viewers across the region. The story resonated with people because it challenged so many assumptions. Here was a breed often feared and misunderstood, demonstrating the kind of gentle nurturing typically associated with human parents. Bruno's care for the raccoons proved that animals, like people, could surprise you with their capacity for love and protection when given the chance. As spring turned into early summer, the raccoons had grown large enough to spend supervised time in Sarah's backyard. Bruno would patrol the perimeter while the babies explored under Sarah's watchful eye. These outdoor sessions were crucial for their development, allowing them to practice natural behaviors like foraging and climbing, while still maintaining the security of their human and canine family. The sight of Bruno shepherding 3 young raccoons around the yard became a daily source of wonder for anyone lucky enough to witness it. By midsummer, the 3 raccoons had reached a size where they needed more than just milk and basic care. Sarah knew that for them to survive in the wild, they needed to learn essential raccoon behaviors that normally would have been taught by their mother. This presented a unique challenge. How could a human and a dog teach wild animals to be wild? The answer came from Bruno himself, who seemed to understand instinctively what the growing raccoons needed to learn. The first lesson came naturally during one of their supervised backyard sessions. Bandit had discovered Sarah's small garden pond and was fascinated by the water. Bruno watched as the young raccoon clumsily attempted to catch the small fish swimming near the surface. Instead of interfering, Bruno positioned himself at the pond's edge and began demonstrating something remarkable. He carefully dipped his paw into the water, moving slowly and deliberately, showing Bandit how to be patient and gentle rather than splashing frantically. Sarah watched in amazement as Bruno seemed to understand that raccoons were natural fishers and needed to develop these skills. Within days, all 3 raccoons were following Bruno's example, learning to move slowly and wait for the right moment. Shadow proved to be the most successful at this, while Pepper preferred to wash her food in the water rather than hunt. Bandit fell somewhere in between, showing great enthusiasm but often losing patience at crucial moments. The teaching extended beyond just water skills. Bruno began leading the raccoons on what Sarah came to call foraging expeditions around the backyard. He would nose around the base of trees, showing them where to look for insects and grubs. When he found something edible, he would step back and allow the raccoons to investigate and learn to identify good food sources. His patient guidance helped them develop the natural curiosity and investigation skills they would need as adult raccoons. Climbing presented another learning opportunity. Wild raccoons are excellent climbers, but these 3 had spent their early weeks in enclosures with limited vertical space. Bruno couldn't climb trees himself, but he found creative ways to encourage their natural abilities. He would position himself at the base of trees, looking up toward the branches and wagging his tail encouragingly when one of the raccoons attempted to climb. If they seemed scared or hesitant, he would remain calm and patient, his steady presence giving them confidence to try again. The raccoons' personalities continued to develop in fascinating ways. Bandit had become the leader of the group, always the first to try new foods or explore new areas of the yard. He had also developed a mischievous streak, often figuring out how to open containers or manipulate objects in ways that surprised both Sarah and Bruno. Shadow remained the most observant, often watching Bandit's adventures before deciding whether to join in. He had become particularly skilled at reading Bruno's body language and seemed to understand the dog's protective signals better than his siblings. Pepper, despite being the smallest, had developed into the most social of the three. She would often choose to nap near Bruno rather than with her brothers, and she had learned to communicate with him through a series of soft chirps and trills that Bruno seemed to understand. This special bond concerned Sarah slightly, as she worried that Pepper might have more difficulty adapting to life without her canine guardian when the time came for release. The local wildlife rehabilitation center had been monitoring the raccoons' progress through regular visits and consultations with Sarah. Dr. Martinez, the center's director, was impressed by how well the animals were developing their natural behaviors despite being raised by humans and a dog. She attributed much of their success to Bruno's unique parenting style, which provided security without preventing them from learning independence. Summer brought new challenges as the raccoons grew larger and more active. They had outgrown their indoor enclosure completely and now spent most of their time in an elaborate outdoor habitat that Sarah had constructed with help from volunteers from the rehabilitation center. The habitat included multiple levels, hiding places, water features, and plenty of space for climbing and exploring. Bruno had his own entrance to the habitat and spent hours each day inside with his adopted family. The neighborhood had fully embraced the unusual family by this point. Children would often gather at Sarah's fence to watch feeding time or to see the raccoons playing with Bruno. Local schools organized field trips to learn about wildlife rehabilitation, and Sarah found herself becoming an unofficial educator about both animal behavior and the importance of giving rescue animals a chance to show their true nature. One particularly memorable incident occurred when a severe thunderstorm hit the area during the night. Sarah woke to find that Bruno had somehow managed to get into the raccoons' outdoor habitat and was sheltering all three babies beneath a covered area he had apparently led them to. The raccoons were huddled against his warm fur, completely calm despite the loud thunder and lightning. This event convinced Sarah that Bruno's protective instincts had evolved beyond simple care into something approaching true parental behavior. The raccoons' foraging skills improved dramatically under Bruno's patient guidance. They learned to identify edible plants, to dig for grubs and insects, and to recognize the sounds that indicated potential food sources. Bruno would often bring them sticks or leaves that he had found during his own explorations of the yard, dropping these items near the raccoons and encouraging them to investigate. Through this play-based learning, they developed the curiosity and investigation skills essential for wild survival. As summer progressed toward fall, Sarah began working with the rehabilitation center to develop a release plan. The raccoons were nearly old enough to survive independently, but the transition would need to be gradual and carefully managed. The plan involved slowly reducing their dependence on provided food while encouraging more natural foraging, expanding their habitat to include areas beyond Sarah's yard, and eventually providing them with the option to leave when they felt ready. Throughout all these preparations, Bruno remained a constant supportive presence. He seemed to understand that changes were coming, and that his role was evolving from active caregiver to supportive guardian. His gentle patience with the raccoons never wavered, even as they became more independent and less reliant on his protection. The bond between the unlikely family had grown so strong that even the wildlife experts were uncertain about how the eventual separation would affect all four animals. As autumn painted the forest behind Sarah's house in brilliant reds and golds, the three raccoons had grown into healthy, capable young adults. They were now almost fully grown, with Bandit weighing nearly 15 pounds, Shadow close behind at 13, and Pepper, though still the smallest, having reached a respectable 10 pounds. Their transformation from helpless babies to skilled foragers had been remarkable. But now came the most challenging phase of their journey, learning to be truly wild. Dr. Martinez from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center visited more frequently now, assessing the raccoons' readiness for eventual release. She was particularly interested in observing their interactions with Bruno, noting how the dynamic between the dog and his adopted family was changing. Bruno seemed to sense that his role was shifting, and he had begun encouraging more independence while still maintaining his protective watch. The first major step in the release preparation involved expanding the raccoons' territory beyond Sarah's backyard. A section of the adjoining forest had been prepared with supplemental feeding stations, but the goal was to encourage the raccoons to find and rely on natural food sources. Bruno played a crucial role in this transition, accompanying the raccoons on their first ventures into the woods while Sarah followed at a distance to monitor their progress. These forest expeditions revealed just how well Bruno had prepared his adopted children for wildlife. Bandit immediately took to climbing the tall oak trees, his natural agility finally having proper space to develop. He would scale heights that made Sarah nervous, but Bruno remained calm below, occasionally barking softly if Bandit ventured too far from the group. Shadow proved to be an excellent forager, quickly learning to identify edible nuts, berries, and insects. His cautious nature, which had seemed like a limitation in the backyard, became a valuable survival trait in the forest. Pepper's smaller size turned out to be an advantage in many ways. She could access food sources that her larger brothers couldn't reach, and her social nature helped her form connections with other woodland creatures. On several occasions, Sarah observed Pepper peacefully sharing feeding areas with wild squirrels and even other raccoons, suggesting that she would integrate well with the existing wildlife population. The seasonal change brought new learning opportunities. Fall meant that natural food sources were abundant, providing perfect conditions for the raccoons to practice their foraging skills. Bruno helped by showing them how to dig through fallen leaves to find insects, and by alerting them to the presence of nut-bearing trees. His keen nose often led them to food sources they might have missed, and his patient supervision gave them confidence to explore areas they might otherwise have avoided. One particularly significant moment came when the small family encountered a group of wild raccoons during one of their forest expeditions. Sarah watched nervously from a distance as the wild raccoons approached cautiously. Bruno positioned himself protectively near his adopted family, but didn't interfere as the two groups investigated each other. The meeting was peaceful, with much sniffing and soft chittering. Bandit, true to his adventurous nature, was the first to approach the wild raccoons while Shadow hung back and observed. Pepper seemed most interested in the social aspects of the encounter, engaging in what appeared to be raccoon conversation with a young female from the wild group. This encounter was encouraging for the rehabilitation team, as it suggested that the three hand-raised raccoons could successfully integrate with their wild cousins. However, it also highlighted the emotional challenge that lay ahead. After the wild raccoons moved on, Pepper returned to Bruno's side and spent the rest of the expedition staying close to him, as if seeking reassurance that her canine father wasn't going anywhere. The nights were becoming cooler, and the raccoons were naturally developing the behavioral patterns they would need for winter survival. They were staying active later into the evening and becoming more efficient at finding and storing food. Bruno adapted his schedule to match theirs, often staying outside well past his normal bedtime to supervise their activities. Sarah marveled at his dedication and worried about how the eventual separation would affect him. Sarah had been documenting the entire journey through photos, videos, and detailed journals. The story had attracted attention from wildlife organizations across the country, and several academic researchers had expressed interest in studying the unique relationship between Bruno and the raccoons. The data being collected could potentially help improve rehabilitation techniques for other orphaned wildlife. But Sarah remained focused on what was best for her unusual family. The release plan involved several stages designed to gradually reduce the raccoons' dependence on human care while maintaining the safety net of Bruno's protection. The first stage had already begun, with the raccoons spending entire nights in the forest while returning to Sarah's yard for morning check-ins. Bruno would wait patiently at the forest edge each morning, greeting the returning raccoons with obvious relief and affection. During one of these morning reunions, Sarah witnessed something that brought tears to her eyes. All three raccoons had returned safely from their night in the forest, but they were clearly tired and somewhat stressed from their adventure. Bruno carefully inspected each one, sniffing them thoroughly and gently licking their faces in a grooming behavior he had developed specifically for them. The raccoons submitted to this care gratefully, and Pepper even fell asleep leaning against Bruno's warm side while he continued his ministrations. The veterinary team conducted final health assessments, confirming that all 3 raccoons were in excellent condition for wild release. Their weights were appropriate, their natural behaviors were well developed, and they showed no signs of being overly dependent on human care. However, their attachment to Bruno remained strong, and this presented both an emotional and practical challenge. For the final release phase, Dr. Martinez developed a unique plan that would honor the special relationship while still allowing the raccoons to become fully wild. The release would happen in stages, with Bruno gradually reducing his supervision time while the raccoons became more comfortable staying away for longer periods. This approach had never been tried before, but the exceptional circumstances seemed to call for an innovative solution. The community had become deeply invested in the success of this unusual family. Local news stations provided regular updates, and a social media following had developed around their story. Children from the nearby school had made get-well cards when Shadow had a minor injury, and the local pet store donated supplies throughout the rehabilitation process. The support network had become an important part of the story, showing how a community could rally around the idea of giving all animals a chance to thrive. November brought crisp mornings and the first frost, signaling that the time for full release was approaching. The raccoons had been spending increasingly longer periods in the forest, sometimes disappearing for 2 or 3 days before returning to check in with Bruno and Sarah. These extended absences were both encouraging and heartbreaking, as they showed the raccoons were developing the independence they needed, while also revealing how difficult the final separation would be for everyone involved. Bruno's behavior during this transition period was remarkable in its sensitivity and wisdom. He seemed to understand that his role was changing from active protector to supportive presence. When the raccoons returned from their forest adventures, he would greet them enthusiastically, but without the intense protective behavior he had shown earlier. He was encouraging their independence while still providing the emotional security they needed during this challenging transition. The first real test came when Bandit failed to return for 3 consecutive days. Sarah was worried sick, checking the forest trails repeatedly and calling his name. Bruno was equally concerned, spending hours at the forest edge looking toward the trees and making soft whining sounds. On the 4th morning, Bandit finally appeared at the backyard fence, looking healthy but noticeably more confident and wild. He allowed Bruno to greet him, but maintained a slight distance that hadn't been there before. Dr. Martinez explained that this was exactly what they hoped to see. Bandit was beginning the natural process of establishing his independence from the family group, which was normal behavior for young male raccoons. However, the emotional impact on Bruno was obvious. The dog spent the next few days staying closer to Shadow and Pepper, as if he was trying to protect them from following their brother's example too quickly. Shadow's transition was more gradual, but equally inevitable. He began staying away for single nights, then weekends, each return showing him becoming more comfortable with forest life. Unlike Bandit's dramatic departure, Shadow's process was methodical and careful, matching his cautious personality. He would return to spend time with Bruno, almost as if he was checking in to make sure his canine father was okay with his growing independence. Pepper's situation was the most complex. Her deep bond with Bruno made her the most reluctant to embrace full wildness. She would venture into the forest with her brothers but always returned first, seeking out Bruno's companionship and comfort. Sarah and the rehabilitation team worried that Pepper might not successfully transition to wildlife, but Dr. Martinez counseled patience, explaining that some animals needed more time to develop confidence in their independence. The community support during this difficult time was overwhelming. Neighbors would stop by to check on Bruno, bringing treats and offering comfort during what everyone recognized was an emotional period for the gentle dog. Mrs. Chen started coming over every evening to sit with Sarah and Bruno, providing quiet companionship as they waited to see which raccoons would return each night. Local wildlife cameras had been set up throughout the forest to monitor the raccoons' activities and ensure they were thriving in their natural environment. The footage revealed encouraging signs. All 3 raccoons were foraging successfully, building appropriate shelters and beginning to interact normally with other wildlife. Bandit had been spotted several times with a group of wild raccoons, while Shadow was developing excellent fishing skills at the forest creek. One particularly touching piece of footage showed Pepper visiting what appeared to be a denning site, but then traveling back toward Sarah's property line, as if she was still torn between two worlds. This behavior confirmed the team's assessment that her transition would take longer than her brother's, but it also showed that she was developing the skills she would need for eventual independence. The hardest moment came on a cold December morning when neither Shadow nor Bandit returned for their usual check-in. Sarah and Bruno waited at the forest edge for hours, but the two brothers didn't appear. Bruno's distress was heartbreaking to watch. He paced along the tree line, whining softly and looking back at Sarah as if asking her to help bring his boys home. That evening, Pepper returned alone, and she too seemed to sense that something had changed permanently. Dr. Martinez assured Sarah that this was normal behavior and likely indicated that Shadow and Bandit had successfully integrated with wild raccoon populations. The cameras continued to show both brothers thriving in the forest, healthy and exhibiting completely natural behaviors. But knowing they were okay didn't make the emotional impact any easier for Bruno or Sarah. Pepper's response to her brother's absence was to become even more attached to Bruno. She would follow him around the yard, sleep near his favorite spots, and show obvious distress when he went inside without her. The rehabilitation team faced a difficult decision. Should they force Pepper's release by removing her from Bruno's environment, or should they allow the relationship to continue even if it meant she might never become fully wild? Sarah advocated strongly for patience, arguing that forcing the separation could be traumatic for both animals. She proposed an alternative approach, allowing Pepper to live a semi-wild life where she could come and go freely between the forest and the yard. This wasn't ideal from a wildlife rehabilitation standpoint, but it recognized the unique emotional bonds that had formed during this extraordinary situation. The compromise solution involved creating a large outdoor habitat that connected directly to the forest, giving Pepper the choice of full wildness or continued association with her human and canine family. This approach had never been tried before, but the exceptional circumstances seemed to warrant an innovative solution. The habitat would allow Pepper to maintain her independence while still providing the emotional security she seemed to need. Christmas morning brought an unexpected gift when both Shadow and Bandit appeared at the forest edge, looking healthy and confident, but maintaining their distance. They observed Bruno and Pepper from about 50 yards away for nearly an hour, before disappearing back into the woods. Bruno's excitement was obvious, his tail wagging as he watched his adopted sons, but he made no attempt to approach them. It was as if he understood that they were visiting to show him they were okay, and that was enough. The sighting gave everyone hope that the bonds formed during those crucial early months would endure in some form, even as the raccoons lived their natural lives in the wild. The rehabilitation had been successful beyond anyone's dreams, creating healthy, capable wild animals while also demonstrating the remarkable capacity for love and sacrifice that exists across species lines. Bruno had given his adopted children everything they needed to survive and thrive, and now he was learning the most difficult part of parenting: letting go. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it new life and unexpected reunions. Bruno had adapted to his quieter life over the winter months, though Sarah could tell he still listened hopefully for familiar sounds from the forest each morning. Pepper had settled into her semi-wild routine, spending days foraging in the woods but returning most nights to sleep near Bruno's favorite spot on the back porch. The arrangement seemed to work for both animals, providing Pepper with independence while maintaining the emotional connection that meant so much to both of them. The first surprise came in March when Sarah spotted a small raccoon family near the creek that ran behind her property. Through binoculars, she could make out a familiar masked face among the group. It was Shadow, now fully grown and apparently with a mate and two small babies of his own. Bruno noticed them too, his ears perking up with interest as he watched from a respectful distance. Over the following weeks, this new family became regular visitors to the area, and Sarah realized that Shadow had chosen to establish his territory close to his childhood home. The most emotional reunion happened on a warm April evening when Sarah and Bruno were enjoying their usual sunset walk around the yard. A rustling in the bushes caught their attention, and out stepped Bandit, now a magnificent adult raccoon with a confident bearing that spoke of successful wild living. He approached slowly, chittering softly in what Sarah recognized as his greeting call from when he was young. Bruno's response was immediate and joyful, his whole body wiggling with excitement as he recognized his first adopted son. What happened next amazed everyone who witnessed it. Bandit walked directly up to Bruno and gently touched the dog's nose with his paw, a gesture of greeting and affection that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Bruno remained perfectly still, allowing the reunion while clearly understanding that Bandit was now a wild animal who needed to maintain appropriate boundaries. The interaction lasted only a few minutes, but it conveyed volumes about the enduring bond between them. Word of these reunions spread through the community and beyond, bringing renewed attention to the extraordinary story. Wildlife researchers were particularly interested in documenting how the hand-raised raccoons were integrating into the local ecosystem. Dr. Martinez published a paper about the rehabilitation process, highlighting how Bruno's unique parenting style had contributed to the unprecedented success of the release. The study became influential in wildlife rehabilitation circles, suggesting new approaches for caring for orphaned animals. Pepper's story took an unexpected turn in late spring when she began showing signs of preparing for motherhood. She had apparently mated with a wild male during one of her forest excursions, and she chose to build her den in the large oak tree where Bruno had first found her and her brothers as babies. The location seemed symbolic, creating a bridge between her wild nature and her deep connection to her adoptive family. Bruno's response to Pepper's pregnancy was touching in its protectiveness and wisdom. He positioned himself as a guardian of her den tree, creating a safe perimeter without interfering with her natural nesting behaviors. When Pepper's babies were born, she made the remarkable decision to bring them down from the tree to introduce them to Bruno, just as her own mother might have introduced her siblings to their father. The sight of Bruno meeting Pepper's 3 tiny babies was profoundly moving. He approached with the same gentle care he had shown toward Pepper and her brothers years earlier, sniffing each baby carefully and making his special soft whining sounds. The babies, with no fear of this enormous dog, crawled toward his warmth just as Pepper had done as an infant. It was as if the cycle of love and protection was beginning anew. Sarah watched this introduction with wonder, realizing that Bruno was now a grandfather of sorts. The gentle giant who had been rescued from a shelter was now part of a legacy that extended into the wild raccoon population of the forest. His influence would continue through generations of animals he had helped raise and protect. The local elementary school, which had followed the family's story from the beginning, organized a special celebration to honor Bruno's contribution to wildlife conservation. Children created artwork depicting the unlikely family, and the school established an annual Bruno Day to teach students about compassion, acceptance, and the importance of giving all animals a chance to show their true nature. As summer progressed, the forest behind Sarah's house became something of a raccoon metropolis. Shadow's family had grown to include 4 young raccoons, and several other families had moved into the area, apparently attracted by the abundant food sources and safe environment. Bruno had become an unofficial protector of this entire community, maintaining his gentle watch over the area while respecting the wild nature of its inhabitants. The most remarkable aspect of this extended family was how the various generations interacted. Bandit would occasionally visit with Pepper's babies, teaching them skills just as Bruno had taught him. Shadow's older children would play with their younger cousins, creating a complex social network that stretched between the wild and domestic worlds. Through it all, Bruno remained a constant, reassuring presence, proving that love and family could transcend species boundaries. Media attention reached a peak when a nature documentary crew came to film the unique community that had developed. The resulting film, titled The Gentle Guardian, won several awards and helped change public perceptions about pit bulls while also raising awareness about wildlife rehabilitation. Bruno became a poster child for the importance of looking beyond breed stereotypes to see the individual character of each animal. Sarah often reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. What started as a simple act of compassion on a rainy night had evolved into something much larger. Bruno had not only saved 3 baby raccoons, he had created a model for how different species could coexist and support each other. His legacy lived on in every raccoon that thrived in the forest, in every person who changed their mind about pit bulls, and in every child who learned that kindness could overcome fear and prejudice. On quiet evenings, Sarah would sit on her porch with Bruno, watching the forest come alive with the sounds of raccoon families going about their daily lives. Sometimes they would catch glimpses of familiar faces among the trees, or hear the distinctive chittering calls that meant one of their raccoons was nearby. Bruno would listen intently to these sounds, his tail wagging softly as he recognized voices from his extended family. The story continued to inspire people around the world. Letters arrived from other animal lovers sharing their own stories of unlikely friendships and successful rehabilitations. Wildlife centers began implementing modified versions of Bruno's patient, protective approach with orphaned animals. The gentle dog who had been unwanted at a shelter had become a teacher whose lessons reached far beyond his own backyard. Years passed, and Bruno aged gracefully, his muzzle growing gray but his gentle spirit remaining unchanged. Pepper's children grew up and had families of their own, and Bruno welcomed each new generation with the same patient love he had shown their mother and uncles. The forest community had become self-sustaining, with wild raccoons teaching their young the skills they needed while still benefiting from the safe environment that Bruno's presence helped maintain. As Bruno entered his senior years, Sarah often marveled at the full circle their lives had taken. The dog who had needed rescuing had become the rescuer, and in saving others he had found his own purpose and joy. The raccoons who had been helpless babies were now contributing to the wild ecosystem, raising their own families, and passing on the lessons of survival and compassion they had learned. The legacy of this extraordinary family extended far beyond their own forest. Bruno's story had helped change laws about pit bull ownership in several communities, demonstrating that individual character mattered more than breed reputation. Wildlife rehabilitation centers across the country had adopted gentler, more patient approaches based on his example. Most importantly, countless children had learned that love, patience, and understanding could overcome fear and create connections that seemed impossible. Bruno's gentle influence had created ripples that would continue long after his own story ended, proving that sometimes the most powerful force for change in the world is simply one being choosing to care for another with complete, unconditional love.